Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm Danny Rogers, PRWeek's Editor-in-Chief, and today we'll be looking at the business performance of PR consultancies over the past year or so, which I know a lot of you listeners will be very interested in. We'll be delving into a new report from the specialist accountants Moore Kingston Smith, who I'm sure you know, and this report looks at the big trends in agency revenues, in profit margins, the costs of employing people, and many other crucial issues for running a PR firm, or indeed any PR team within any organisation. I think the same principles apply. Joining me to discuss this report is Esther Carder, who's a partner at Moore Kingston Smith. Hello, Esther. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Danny. Nice to see you again too.
Yeah, Esther and I have actually worked together on PR industry reports on and off for about 20 years now, I just realised. And
Probably is about that long, yes. Hate to admit it, but
although I haven't seen you for a while, so it's nice to see you again. Right, so let's look at some of the figures from your report. All listeners will be able to see the report on prweek.co.uk from today, Wednesday. And from what I've seen, the report contains some particularly concerning figures on profit margin. Average profit margin at agencies surveyed in the report fell from 18.5% the previous year to 12.9% this year. That's quite a big drop. There was also a slight overall year-on-year fall in income. That is when it's adjusted for inflation. Gross income grew by a reasonable 6.5%, but I believe that was outmuscled by that pesky inflation, right, Esther?
it certainly was outmuscled by quite a bit, yes.
But there are some reasons to be hopeful, as I'm sure we'll find out as our conversation ensues over the next half an hour or so. So let's begin. Perhaps, Esther, you could give me a bit of background about the report and what you look at in it.
Yeah, sure. So we've been doing this report for quite a long time now. In fact, this was our 34th year of doing the report. And it's a report into the financial performance of all marketing services sectors. So as well as PR, we look at things like advertising and design. We take filed accounts from Companies House, so it's all publicly available information. So in the main, the results that we're looking at will be companies with a 31st December 2023 year end. And then we take things like their turnover, their gross income, staff costs, and then we look at lots of different KPIs, so lots of ratios. We look at the staff cost ratio, operating profit margin, productivity ratios, etc. Benchmark them against all the other marketing disciplines that we're looking at, and obviously look at the trends over the years as well.
So I think you also look at media consultancies and advertising consultancies as well, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, we should talk a bit about that later on maybe, because I believe that PR is performing better than some other disciplines in that sense. But
It is, yeah.
Yeah. But let's begin by talking about this drop in average margin, profit margin. Did I get those figures right, Esther? It was that fall from 18 down to 12.9, is that right?
Yes, you did get that figure right. Yeah, it's quite a big dip really, isn't it? And I think it can largely be explained by the contraction in fee income. So as you said, whilst it looked like there was some growth in fee income, by the time you adjust that for inflation, actually income had on the whole contracted. Now, I will caveat that by saying PR sector was not alone in that. In fact, every single discipline that we looked at right across the marketing services spectrum, they all had a inflation adjusted contraction in income. And actually the contraction across the PR agencies was slightly lower than some of the other sectors. So even though it contracted, it was not the most offensive in its contraction, if you like. And I think, it's really difficult to be increasing your profit margins in the face of decreased income. In addition to this survey, we also do an outlook survey, which sort of tracks current sentiment twice a year. And when we did that back in the back end of 2022, people were, reasonably optimistic about what 2023 would hold. And I suspected, therefore, staffed up for it or, got their staffing levels geared up for the level of income they thought was going to be forthcoming. But it just wasn't. As we've seen, income actually ended up contracting during 2023. And so, staff costs obviously were just out kilter with the rate that the income was coming in. The staff cost ratio worsened. So we would normally say keep your staff cost within 60% of your fee income. The percentage was about 62%. So it was kind of worse than the target we would set. So really more people than they probably needed to service the income they had, off the back of the fact that they thought 2023 was going to be better. And obviously that has led to a decrease in the profit margin, sadly. But again, not alone. Pretty much every sector, apart from media buyers, which tend to behave in a slightly different way anyway, every sector saw a decline in their profit margins.
So it's a double whammy in a way, in that the economy wasn't as good as people expected in 2023 because of, I suppose, all sorts of reasons, war and general economic problems, but also the fact that costs went up, right, for businesses.
Yeah.
That was largely staff costs, more than office costs was the increase in cost.
Yeah, I guess, office costs don't play into things quite so much for two reasons. One, because people are working from home quite a lot still, and also because obviously you tend to be locked in to a longer term contract with office costs. So even if inflation has suddenly gone up, it's not going to suddenly increase your rental costs. And actually, we did look at rental costs across the whole of the marketing services disciplines that we look at by looking at the sort of the lease disclosure note in the accounts. And actually, overall rental costs hadn't gone up if you compared it as a proportion of fee income. But of course, we had the Liz Truss mini budget in September 2022.
Yeah.
That kicked off a whole series
didn't help lots
did
of
not
things,
help.
did it?
No, a whole series of events. One of which was obviously inflation was already increasing, and then it just increased even more. And of course, 2023 bore the brunt of that full year of heavy inflation. And of course, a lot of that, filtered through to staff costs. And even if it wasn't filtering through to staff costs, it was filtering through to other overhead costs as well. So that, combined with clients not spending anywhere near as much as people might have originally expected them to, yeah, you're right, coming at agencies from all angles, really.
Yeah. And yet, although it was a big drop in margin for that particular year, down to 12.9%, historically, that's not terrible, is it, as a profit margin for PR consultancies? I believe sort of pre-pandemic, you sometimes got years where it was 12, 13, 14.
It has been down at the sort of 13, 14 level before, so it's not one of the worst years. If we look, I'm just having a look now, but back to sort of through 2010 right through to 2019, we had a low of 11.9 and a high of 14.5. So it sort of sits within that range, really. We had a couple of toppy years before that. So I guess the drop looks more than it might otherwise have done, because we had a bit of post-COVID bounce when growth sort of, obviously because in the COVID year 2020, again, there was a contraction in income then for PR and most marketing services disciplines. And then after that, when we had a bit of a bounce, they had a bit of a sort of a kicker on the margin. So it's come down to more normal levels, but sort of maybe perhaps the slightly lower end of the more normal levels, but not disastrous by any stretch.
No, not disastrous, but obviously if you're a PR boss, you want to get it back up there, particularly because it's been higher in recent years. So do you sense that this is a big problem for the bosses of PR consultancies and other consultancies, this drop in margin?
Yeah, look, an average is an average at the end of the day. And, within that average 12.9, there were plenty of PR agencies that were doing better than that. So if we have a look sort of individually, there were 10 agencies that were doing over 20% margin. Now, 20% is the margin that we would set as a target for any agency, with a 15% margin as a sort of a minimum. And there were 13 agencies achieving over that 15%, 10 of which achieved more than 20% margin. So, there are still agencies out there that are performing well, but obviously that average is dragged down by a few loss-making agencies and some that are sort of making sub 10% margins. But,
yeah,
on the whole, the PR industry does tend to hold its head high when compared to other sectors. And this year, it was second only to media buyers, which is quite often the case. I mean, sometimes PR has been the top margin performer of all the disciplines, actually. But, it was 12.9, media buyers was 17.3, and all of the other disciplines were sub 10. So, you've got to look at it in the context.
What were advertising agencies making last year?
Advertising agencies did 9.9, so just under the 10, and they were 11.1 in the previous year. So even in the previous year, which was a better year, they were still doing lower than this year's result for PR. PR has a lot of retainer income, and that does help it be able to better forecast its resource needs, and as a result, it tends to use a lot less freelancers than some of the other sectors. So that does help its margin be more stable.
I see. Okay. And you said that there were a dozen or so agencies that got more than 20%. Was there any trend in the type of PR agencies that were making really good margins?
I mean, we looked at those that had grown, actually. So we looked at those that had more than 10% real income growth. So if we adjusted their growth for inflation, the ones that had more than 10%. And actually, a lot of those had quite a chunk of influencer consulting in them, and also a little bit of tech as well. But influencers seem to be more of the theme across them. So I guess it's a bit in vogue at the minute. People are spending quite a lot of money on influencer budgets, and PR. Some PR consultancies have benefited from that.
I see. So it wasn't so much the size of the agency that made them more profitable, or the fact they were independent or part of a group or anything. It was more the fact that they happened to have technology clients or did a lot of influencer work.
Yeah, I mean, that's helped them have like real income growth more than 10%. And like I say, higher margins tend to follow those that are having positive income growth. I mean, when we looked at, we do strata the margin between agencies that are independent versus those that are group. And actually this year and last year, and I think the year before, haven't gone back further than that, the independent agencies did achieve a slightly higher margin than the group agencies. I think there's like a couple of percent in it, which seems to be down to their slightly lower overheads, because the staff cost ratio is actually very similar.
Yes, if you're a large agency and you need to cut staff costs, it's much more difficult, right? Because you've got big overheads, big businesses, and it's more difficult to adjust to an economic downturn. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Small independent agencies, I say small independent agencies on the whole, they tend to be on average slightly smaller, but that's not always the case. But they're able to make more nimble decisions. There's not all the chain of command that you need to go through to make all of these decisions. So they probably can react a little bit quicker. And I suspect, they know they're not going to have the support of the group around them if things get tricky or difficult. So when it comes to sort of spending on overheads, they're, perhaps a little bit leaner.
Yeah. Now, your figures in this report very much reflect the Top 150 report that we produced earlier this year. Although our Top 150 doesn't go into profit margins, it's much more about top line growth. But certainly the top line growth figures were much the same in both our reports. Can we talk a bit more about employment costs? Because there's obviously been a big talking point for the past couple of years or so, and even more so after the Labour government's most recent budget. So what does the report tell us about employment costs in 2023? And are agencies tightening up their salaries as a result, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I mentioned before with the employment cost ratio, i.e. the amount of gross income that agencies spend on staff costs, we recommend it be no more than 60%. And it had gone up by nearly a couple of percent from last year's survey to this year's survey. And obviously that's largely to do with inflation filtering through. Of course, now we've got, the added problem of another full year of all those inflationary costs still being there, but agencies probably thinking a little bit more carefully about what pay rises they give. But obviously now we've got all of the additional national insurance costs on top of that, the rate going up, and also the salary at which it kicks in coming down as well. And obviously we've seen some massive headline figures from some of the big multinational organisations about how many extra millions it's going to cost them, and that the PR sector's not going to be immune to that. And I think the general thinking is that ultimately that is probably going to filter its way through to people's pay packets, i.e. people not getting quite so much of a pay rise. But we
Yeah,
know it remains to be seen what the average staff cost ratio for the December 2024 results ends up being. Are agencies able to balance that with pay rises, or are they going to need to still give those pay rises to make sure they attract the best talent? And therefore, we're just going to see that staff cost ratio nudge its way up even more, which inevitably will have an impact on the bottom line.
yeah, and I guess you've got two choices if you're an employer and the staff costs are going up. Either you keep salaries tight, or you cut down the numbers of people you employ on those
Yeah.
salaries. And so we may see, as well as salary inflation moderating, we may see staff numbers falling. Do you think?
Well, we may well do, and PR agencies may just have to, work their people a little bit, not harder, but smarter. And I suppose this is where maybe, we'll see AI starting to come into its own, perhaps, affording a little less of the sort of the basic grunt work being done, instead of being done by individuals, being done by AI.
Which would mean you'd need fewer people. Is the logic of that?
Yeah, it is. I guess it just depends to what extent the cost of implementing that AI initially outweigh and sort of training everyone up on it as well, because it's all very well having AI, but you've got to train people how to best use that AI and how to best prompt that AI to give you the right content. Yeah, it depends which outweighs the other, I suppose. But I guess the
Yeah.
general thinking is that AI, is meant to be the great thing that's going to bring efficiencies, help us to produce content and help improve our margins. But I guess it'll take a while probably for agencies to feel the full effect of that.
Yeah, I did. I don't know if you probably didn't see it, but I did an interview with Matt Neal at Golin in PRWeek last week, and his big point was AI is just going to totally revolutionise the PR industry, and that within 3 or 4 years we could see some big agencies either going to the wall and others thriving. So I'm sure you're right. This how PR agencies employ AI is going to make all the difference to both not only their profitability but possibly even their existence in the next few years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a great deal of crystal ball gazing needs to be done to know which way that's going to land. But I guess agencies have got to embrace it. I mean, if you don't embrace it, you are going to go to the wall probably. You've got to embrace it, and you've got to make it work smart for you and try and stay ahead of the game and stay ahead of everyone else to make sure you're not one of those agencies that suffers at its hands.
Absolutely right. We talked a bit about the top line. Do you think that clients in general have been less willing to increase fees over the last year? Or do you think that agencies have just been accepting lower flat increases in fee levels?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of both, isn't it? I mean, we did our Outlook survey this October, and the general consensus across all marketing disciplines was we asked whether client spend had sort of returned or increased in 2024 compared to 2023, and only a third said that it had, and 2/3 said that it really hadn't increased in 2024. And then we also asked about whether people were under pressure to hold their rates, and about half of agencies responding said yes, they'd been under pressure to hold their rates as they were, and about 20% had been under pressure to decrease their rates. Which, given how high inflation is, obviously, if you want to maintain your profitability, you need to increase your rates in line with inflation, or at least in line with the inflation increases that you're giving your staff. And it really does feel that agencies have been unwilling/unable to do that. It's really difficult, and obviously they're going to be having a lot of pushback from procurement, but you've really got to try and keep those rates nudging up a little bit every 6 months, or at least every year. Otherwise you can never get back those years that you didn't put those inflationary increases in. And it comes down to being brave, I suppose, and being confident in your proposition, being confident that you're the best agency out there for that client, and having a really strong relationship with them such that they will sort of accept increased rates. But, it's easier said than done, as
Yeah,
reflected in the results for the year.
well, we will have obviously some client side professionals listening to this
Yeah.
podcast. So I guess they've got to realise that they have to increase their fees a bit if they want their agencies to carry on thriving. It's a tough one, isn't it? But I know the costs are going up for clients as well. The staff costs are going up for clients. They're caught in the same squeeze. It's a tricky one.
It is difficult. And of course, if agencies aren't getting paid properly for the work that they're doing, they're not going to be able to pay their staff properly. If they can't pay their staff properly, they're not going to attract the best talent. If they can't attract the best talent, then clients are not going to get the best output from them. And that ultimately is going to affect their success. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, or a virtuous circle, whichever way you look at it.
So clients, I hope you're listening. Increase your fees a bit. Help the agencies out. What margin do you think agencies should be aiming for now, based on everything we've discussed?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've always said aim for 20%, aim for 15% is an absolute minimum. And some people will say, well, that's just too high, given that the average margin is generally, or certainly pretty much always below the 20%, and quite often it's below the 15%. But again, it's back to my point of when, an average is an average. And if you actually delve down into the detail within that, there are agencies that have done better than others, and there are 10 or so agencies that have managed to achieve 20%. And generally speaking, those are the agencies that have managed to control their staff costs, so that, they've been realistic with their forecasting, and they've managed their resources well.
In all your time covering this industry and the marketing services industries, are agencies generally smarter now on how they run themselves? Are they getting more tuned in to the sort of margins they need, and are they achieving them?
I think so. Yeah, I do. If I compare now to sort of 10, 15 years ago, I definitely think agencies are smarter, more financially grown up, more attuned to, even if it's just because they keep listening to me banging on about it, more attuned to all the KPIs that they need to be monitoring. And, the timeliness of financial information is much better now in terms of all the software and the management information that agency have got to actually produce this information, and produce information on job costing for specific clients. So knowing which clients are more profitable than others, which disciplines are more profitable than others, which types of clients they should be working with. All of that information, I think, is much higher quality and coming through a lot quicker now from sort of information management systems. So agencies don't really have too many excuses for not being aware of all of the financial KPIs that they need to be achieving.
Yeah, and I think all the advice you've provided over the years, and hopefully PRWeek has provided, has educated people in that. But it's, again, I've been covering the industry about as long as you have, and there's still a lot of people who go in to run a PR agency who maybe their passion is for the craft, isn't it? And they're not necessarily as tuned in as they need to be for the profit imperatives of running a business.
Yeah, I think that certainly has been the case over the years, and will always be the case to a certain degree. Like you say, some people are doing it for the passion and the love of what they do, and some people will just run lifestyle businesses where actually they want to make a decent living out of it, but they're not interested in sort of growing it beyond the clients that they're able to look after. And so those sort of agencies will always have a certain maximum size that they can grow to, depending on how many partners are involved in that business. And that's very different from somebody that wants to grow something, beyond the name above the door. And those agencies who want to grow it beyond that very much do need to be paying heed to all of the KPI targets that they need to be hitting.
Yeah, and even those lifestyle businesses, of which I'm sure we can identify hundreds, even they need to keep an eye on margins, though, don't they? Even they will be hit. If they employ people, they'll have the same challenges, even if they want to survive, right?
They will do, yeah. They'll have all the same challenges. And the one KPI I always say to people, if there's one KPI that you pay attention to, it's your staff cost ratio. If you can keep that to sort of within 60% or even in the very low 60s, unless you're going, very wrong on other overhead spend, then you should be making a half decent margin off of the back of that. So yeah, you're right. They do need to be looking at their financials as well.
So that's Esther's golden rule. Don't go over the 60%.
Don't go above the 60%. So do not spend more than 60% of your revenues, is probably what people call it, i.e. your turnover less your third-party recharge costs. So don't spend more than 60% of your revenues on people, basically.
Yeah, and does that differ in different types of agencies? So do presumably media agencies have a lower ratio.
Yeah, they're all the same. They're all 60 apart from media, where we say 55% because it's less labour intensive, and as is shown by their generally higher margins.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, let's finish off with more of a positive, hopefully. And what trends do you expect to see in 2025 next year? And do you think agencies have reason to be positive looking ahead?
Yeah, I mean, 2025 surely has got to be the year when it all starts to get a little bit easier, right? We've had a difficult 2023, we've had a difficult 2024. When we've asked clients in our Outlook survey when they think income will return, to be fair, the majority said 2025. There were some that said 2026. Let's hope we don't have to wait that long. But I mean, I don't think it's suddenly going to go through the roof. It's probably going to be a sort of a gradual return to spend, and hopefully a sort of respectable growth in fee income next year. But agencies are more prepared for it now. They've had a tough couple of years. They'll have made the corrections in their staffing and their resources that they need to. And I think they will go into 2025 with a lot more caution than they went into 2023, thinking things are going to be great, had a couple of tough years. They're prepared for whatever comes in 2025, I think. So hopefully, I don't think we're suddenly going to see margins bounce up loads, but I think we will see them nudge up a little bit compared to those that we've seen in this year.
So it's two things really. You're saying that both firms are leaner and they've adapted to these tougher times already, and secondly, you think that hopefully top line will grow next year as well.
Yeah, I think we should see positive growth next year, if only because inflation won't decimate any actual growth that's there to quite the same extent. But I think also because people are expecting clients to loosen the purse strings a little bit more in 2025. So for both of those reasons, we'll see positive real income growth, hopefully across all the marketing services disciplines, but no reason why that won't include PR. And like you were saying, people will have right-sized their resource requirements to deal with a couple of tough years, and so therefore they can resource up gradually as they need to deal with any increase in income in 2025.
And does that also factor in the cost hike that companies are going to see? I think it's from April, isn't it? The new national insurance costs go in.
I think that depends the extent to which that gets held back from pay rises to sort of cancel it out a little bit, or whether agencies they're still going to need to give pay rises, but I think they'll probably be a little bit leaner than they might otherwise have been. So even though it perhaps is going to feel a little bit easier from an income growth perspective, from a margin perspective, it's still going to be challenging, which is why I don't think margins are suddenly going to bounce up, because they're going to have those pressures fighting against them as well.
I see. Really, really interesting. Okay, Esther, well, thank you for finishing on a positive note. I think we're all looking forward to 2025 and starting a new year. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this episode. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you again. And I really appreciate you taking the time to discuss your report and give all your insights. And as I say, that will be available on PRWeek rest of this week from today. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. And do check out prweek.co.uk for lots of other news and information. Thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.